Hello, everyone, and welcome to WiCSME2022. I'm happy to welcome you here, and let's start the session by each one of you introducing herself. Shall we go with Kerry-Ann?
Hi, I'm Kerry-Ann Barrett, the Cybersecurity Program Manager at the Organization of American States. I've been working in this field for over 8 years, and I thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Kat, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Wafa. Hello, everybody. My name's Kat Jones. I lead on international cyber governance for the UK's Foreign Office. And so I'm involved in a lot of debates at the United Nations on cybersecurity. And it's really great to be here joining this wonderful panel of colleagues working on the global cyber debate.
Thank you. And shall we introduce Francine?
Hello, dear ladies. My name is Francine Esuma. I am a computer engineer. I work at the National Agency of ICT, which is the secular arm of the state of Cameroon in terms of ICT, and I'm in charge of studies assistant to the cooperation and partnership unit. I represent Cameroon in gender issues within the OEWG program of the UN, as to all the other panelists here. Thank you once again for your invitation to contribute by my modest person to these exchanges of general interest in order to urgently respond to the needs of the hour relating to the place of women in the field of ICT. Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice to have such distinguished female diplomats here with us and longstanding friends of WiCSME. Welcome once again, and delighted to have you here. As you know, the UN is drafting a convention on cybercrime, and countries are finding themselves in need to exercise the art of cyber diplomacy. This is in order to protect and promote their interest in cyberspace. We also see that new technologies are shaping the process and structure of multilateral relations, and the role of diplomats evolving continuously to match. We now, today, women, including all of those who are on the panel today, are playing a leading role in the process and in the negotiation process. So, and we saw this firsthand in the open-ended working group. To start, I'm going to, I think the title of the session is very intriguing, Leading Cybersecurity in an Insightful and Diplomatic Way. This is a statement that could mean different things to different people. And I'd like to start the discussion with that and address this question to everyone. So we'll start off with Kerry-Ann, and then we'll move to Kat, and then Francine. And can you please tell me what it means to you, leading cybersecurity in an insightful and diplomatic way?
Thanks for that question, Wafa. I think I would want to take it from the perspective of what does that mean when you work within a regional organization, recognizing that regional organizations represent multiple national views, and it represents multiple national positions, as well as it takes into account the regional context and the threats that we face in the region as well. And leading in an insightful and diplomatic way, from my perspective, would mean that there's a need for balance, recognizing that respect for sovereignty is one thing, leading by example is another, and providing the venue to ensure that all our member states have the same level of knowledge, capacity, access to information, access to participate in these forums is critical. So just in a nutshell, leading in an insightful way is to ensure that we understand our role as a regional organization and how we can contribute to facilitate the discussions for our members.
Thank you, that's very good. And shall we move on to Kat? What does leading cybersecurity in a diplomatic and insightful way mean to you?
Thanks, Wafa. And perhaps I can give the partner view to Kerry-Ann's regional organisation view, obviously coming from the view of a single state. I think because cyber is a multidisciplinary topic, we see leadership across so many different areas, from industry to academia, civil society, and then into government. But I think across all of those areas, and hopefully between them as well, the best leaders are bringing communities together around a vision. And internationally, of course, there are many visions for cyberspace, some of which are significantly different from each other. And Kerry-Ann deals with the challenge of bringing those together every day. But I think for me, obviously, as a UK representative, the UK's vision is one of a free, open, peaceful and secure cyberspace, and one where the UK aspires to be a responsible democratic cyber power. And that vision of a free, open, secure and peaceful cyberspace is quite familiar to people. The UN and many countries have a similar version of words that they use to describe the cyberspace they want. But the vision of a democratic and responsible cyber power is quite new. And in this context, cyber power means the ability to kind of direct or influence others through cyberspace the same way as we do in the real world. Now, I think a lot of states would prefer to see a cyberspace without this kind of cyber power concept, and indeed we recognise that as the UK too. But we also think that the time has passed in which that's actually realistic. And if we're going to have these kind of capabilities, then the only way they can be effectively managed is by being transparent, by being predictable, and having a real discussion around what the term responsible means in that context. So for me, as the UK, leadership is about trying to drive that conversation and make that happen. And then in terms of insightful and diplomatic, I aspire to be insightful. I think it's really about listening to others really carefully, both across the whole of society and between states. So it's really only when we listen and really hear that we're going to kind of find ways to develop those shared understandings. Diplomacy can be super hard, but for me, it's about taking that insight and turning it into the action that takes us forward on difficult topics, even if that's just a small step. Maybe seize that opportunity of what you've heard when you were listening, when you gained that insight. It's not easy, but I think it's really worthwhile.
Yes, thank you, Kat. That's really wonderful. Listening is very important to arrive at a shared understanding. Francine, shall I give the floor to you?
Thank you for this question. I would like to say that the exponential growth of information and communication technologies and the ever-increasing opportunities that arise from them in real time and in a borderless environment means that cybersecurity is becoming a complex cross-border issue that requires the establishment of international cooperation to ensure a secure internet. However, talking about cybersecurity also means talking about cybercrime, which has become a multi-billion-dollar a year business in terms of fraud, identity theft, crime, etc., affecting thousands of people around the world, as well as government, businesses, etc. Thus, I could say from my experience that at the UN and my personal opinion that the United States nations has undertaken through different programs such as OEWG to organize in a diplomatic way exchanges around cybersecurity in order to address the issues and challenges concerning cybersecurity, thus involving member states, the UN system, the public and private sector, as well as other civil society organizations, NGO, etc., and particularly gender interested in cybersecurity. Formal and informal meetings, debates, plenary discussions, online exchanges, etc., are created within the UN system to address the issue of cybersecurity in an insightful manner, with the aim of creating awareness at the international policy level by providing members with a picture of the current situation and challenges related to cybersecurity. Secondly, identifying a range of existing policies and best practice initiatives from around the world in order to build a culture of cybersecurity. And finally, exploring options for a global response to the growing cybercrime, while observing that developing countries do not have sufficient capacity to combat cyber attacks and crime. The lack of partnership between developed and developing countries that can generate safe havens in which cyber criminals can take advantages of legal loopholes. Leading cybersecurity in an insightful and diplomatic way is also about interactivity to foster exchanges, integration of all stakeholders to reach mutual consensus. In conclusion, the president of ECOSOC, Her Excellency Mr. Lazarus Kampabwe, said, "We all agree that cybersecurity is a global problem that can only be solved through a global partnership. It affects all our organizations, and the UN office is ready to apply its strategic and analytical expertise to address these issues." Thank you.
Thank you, Francine. Thank you. And my second question is to you, Francine. You represented Cameroon in the open-ended, the UN open-ended working group, and also you're part of the UN program on women in cyber governance. So my question to you is, how do you think women are shaping the international debate on cyber security and cyber governance? And where do you think their mark is most visible? What are you doing to unify and connect their voices?
Thank you for giving me the floor once again. It is not easy to find an answer to this question, because the reason why the question is asked is because the voice of women is not yet well heard. But let's note a considerable progress in the representation of women in an international debate. To come back to the question, I think with my little experience in the United Nations, that the women who are shaping the international debates on e-governance are those who have intellectual backgrounds, who are in higher positions of responsibility through hard work, perseverance, optimism, positive thinking. Also, the rate of women's representation is increasing. Their inclusion in different programs without restriction, their speaking out to make their voices heard is helping to shape the debate. Secondly, where do you think the mark most visible? Well, in my opinion, the most visible mark is the increasing number of women's responsibilities and representation in higher decision-making bodies, in positions that were once reserved for men, who are now beginning to trust female ingenuity. Men far outnumber women in e-governance, so it is up to women to be mentors and advocates for the next generation. It is our job to continually enable women to create opportunities so that they stay and grow over time. Supporting women's career progression and increasing their visibility is important. We need to do a better job of showing the broad spectrum. And the last question is, without being at the decision-making level, I do contribute to trying to unify and make women's voices heard by bringing recommendations from the UN sessions related to women, by creating interest among the different stakeholders in the process to include women. At the international level, I proposed the creation of a network of women from different sectors to exchange on internet governance issues, to connect it, or to set up a program that could interact with UN programs, such as UN ODC Africa Women to a Cyber Professional Group. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Francine. That's wonderful. And I'm going to move over to Kerry-Ann now. Kerry-Ann, you have personally worked with multiple OAS countries on their cybersecurity framework. What is the current state of play in relation to cybersecurity collaboration? And looking at your CV, I know you are an attorney at law. So what do you think countries should do to successfully build or successfully achieve cyber resilience by design from the perspective of international law?
Thanks again, Wafa, for the insightful question. It is a very loaded question too. It's a lot of layers in that. I think when I think about the state of play, it's important to recognize that the OAS in 2004 recognized the need to have a regional strategy on cybersecurity. And as far back as then, they also recognized in that strategy the need to establish incident response teams and a network. They call it a hemispheric network of incident response teams. And for those listening who may not know what that is, because some persons still don't know what a CIRT is, it's really a group of persons that respond to incidents at the national level and the international level and help nations to recover. So one of the important things when you think about the state of play across our region is to think about what is the gaps that we have in terms of capacities. You have countries with populations as small as Antigua, and we have populations as large as the United States, Canada, and Brazil, as an example, within our member states. So we need to recognize that given the vast maturity, either in digital transformation or in digital connectivity, maturity in terms of understanding cybersecurity and participating. For the Americas, it's a wide range. The state of play in terms of how they can participate, engage on the global agenda, contribute to the discussions, but most importantly, implement any decisions that may come out of these UN processes. And that's one of the reasons when we do intervene, we speak about capacity building a lot. We speak about confidence building measures a lot, because one of the things that happens is whatever is agreed in terms of information sharing, it also requires that member states have the ability to capture the data, collate the data, and share among themselves. It's important to then recognize that within the OAS, we have several structures that supports this. Over the years, we've done what is called confidence, security, and building measures. And a part of that has always spoken to the designation of points of contacts. Most specifically within 2018, we started to develop cybersecurity confidence building measures. And we have a working group that was established on confidence building measures in cyberspace. And that alone gave the ability to, one, designate points of contacts. It also spoke about information sharing. So in terms of the UN and what the state of play is, our region is not immune to the threats. Ransomware is something that has plagued us, especially over the past few months. And one of the things that we see as needed is to continue to share information to be able to unilaterally respond, because you'd have data for your nation, but also regionally try to build up the capacities to work together to respond to these incidents. As it relates to your last question, which is on international law and how our member states can actually participate in that, it's important to think about it from the perspective of each country would have to have a legal framework in place. One of the things that we do within the OAS through what we call our Ministers of Justice Working Group is we support member states in looking at their international law context. We also support them building capacities to draft their own cybercrime legislation. And we support judges and prosecutors in training to be able to apply those legislations as well. Further, we have more recently started to do several courses around the applicability of international law to cyberspace. That has been done through our Hague process, which we did with the government of the Netherlands and subsequently with Canada. We have implemented several trainings around cyber diplomacy for persons to start familiarizing themselves with the UN processes and cybersecurity. We provided with an overview of the normative frameworks of responsible state behavior, as Kat spoke about earlier. And in addition, we present legal frameworks and tools for cross-border digital crime cooperation, such as the UNODC Practical Guide for Requesting Electronic Evidence. So from that perspective, as a body, we try to ensure that, as I said earlier, to give the knowledge to our member states to be able to think about themselves. And to the aspect of digital transformation and security by design, security by design is a concept that the technicians speak about so often, but at the policy level, it's a concept that oftentimes get lost because it's usually the consequence of not doing that policy makers see, not usually beforehand. So security by design, we often say that if the capacities are built up at the national level and the frameworks are in place, so you have your cybercrime legislation, you have your data protection legislation, you have your freedom of access information, almost automatically when you begin to do projects and digital transformation projects by design, the legal frameworks to support that would actually assist to respond when incidents happen or when things happen. And then the last part is capacity building. If your clinicians who are negotiating these contracts for the transformation or the introduction of digital services to government understand the risks, then automatically if they understand the risk, they'll start to build that into their request for proposals for contractors who are providing the services. If they understand the risk and the consequences, they'll automatically negotiate stronger contracts. And then thirdly, if it is that they understand the risk, they'll start to put the resources, the financial commitments needed to mitigate the risk and respond when they happen. So I'll hand back over to you, Wafa.
Fascinating, thank you. It's a long, it's a packed question, as you said, but I couldn't help but ask it. Looking at your CV, it was so impressive. Thank you very much. And I'm going to ask this question to Kat. Kat, in your role as leading the UK delegation to the open-ended working group, you played a key role in the third outstanding session. And the third outstanding session produced a consensus report, as you may know. So what advice or insights would you give countries currently in the process of preparing for the next round of negotiation? What kind of advice would you give them? Thank you.
Thanks, Wafa. And before I answer your question, I just briefly wanted to pick up on what both Kerry-Ann and Francine said then. Kerry-Ann mentioned the importance of designated points of contact and people that you can go and talk to in different countries when there's an issue or when you want to discuss something. And Francine, who's part of the Women in Cyber programme at the UN, has downplayed her role, I think, saying that she's not at the decision-making level. But Francine turns up to the negotiations and is present, and sometimes it's just about being there and having that relationship with somebody. I know that if I want to know something about what's happening with Cameroon, I know that Francine she might not know the answer straight away if I ask her a difficult question, but she's there and she will do her best to find that out. And that really, sometimes I think in international relations is really what it's all about, being present and having a voice and being able to kind of find answers and work with other people. So I just wanted to kind of say that whilst we were here. Looking at the OEWG, so the annual progress report, which we agreed in July, I think was really significant. Looking at its content, we might think it falls a bit short of what we would have liked it to include. And I think that's quite common with multilateral negotiations. And I think that's the case for most countries who are involved in the discussions. We all have ambitions for the agreements that we'd like to see, but the truth of multilateral negotiations is that they can be very slow, they can be very incremental, and their progress is influenced by two things. One is where there's a difference in the views of the substance of the topic of debate. But the second is the geopolitical environment, the willingness of countries to put their differences aside and find that common ground. And so at the moment, given a difficult international situation, it really is that agreement on anything, even if quite limited, shows that despite the big differences in the views on substance, that there really is political willingness of countries to come together, and that states do want to find that common ground where they can. So I think that's a really positive sign, even if it hasn't quite translated into delivery in the way that we would really like. So looking forward to this year's negotiations, if we're going to carry on and make some progress, we need countries to be really smart in how they approach the debates. I think the first thing I would say is that we need to identify really clearly and quite early on what it is that we want. So ideally, countries would be asking for something that was already referenced in the existing report, so we have a starting point of agreement to build off. And ideally, any asks would be made early and quite often. So very often we see particularly smaller or more limited resource states find themselves in the position of coming to the final round of a negotiation and asking for something that hasn't been fully discussed. And that's really understandable in the situation. But at that point of the negotiation, things can be quite tense. People aren't very open to talking about new ideas. They're concerned they might end up agreeing to something they haven't fully thought through. And so that quite often leads to disappointment. So for me, early and often is kind of a key for the ask. I think, secondly, all the proposals need a really active support base. So it's very rare that a significant proposal made by a single state actually gets through a process. It's quite resource intensive, but proposals which have got a lot of regional support or ideally cross-regional support are much more likely to go forward. Obviously, that gives the advantage to states that have more resource available to kind of put into the process. But I think countries can use their resources smartly. They'll have colleagues based in New York at the UN who can talk to other people. They'll have colleagues based in regional organisations like Kerry-Ann's who can talk to people and make good contacts. And in my experience, the larger and better resourced countries are always really pleased if one of the smaller countries or less mature countries in this area comes to them with an idea and says, please, could you help us push this through? Would you get on board with this idea? So I would really encourage people to get out and connect with other countries on their ideas for what should happen. And then finally, I would say perhaps try and be a bit realistic, take it step by step. Aiming high is really good, but compromise is always going to be needed in these processes. And as I said, the process tends to be incremental. So aim high, but consider what you might realistically get out of this round and how maybe this round could be a stepping stone to the next round where you might achieve the full aim that you want. So what's the halfway point and how could you build on that? I think slow and steady often wins the race diplomatically.
Wonderful. That's such good advice. Thank you. Especially when it comes to countries who are not so resource rich. Do you basically advise them to go back to the report and pick up one of the subjects and move ahead with that? Because I was always under the impression that whoever comes with a new idea is probably more proficient. Do you see what I mean? But no, thank you for this. And this is really lovely. So I'm going to ask all of you another question. And it's basically related to how optimistic are you that the current negotiation process might actually lead to a binding instrument in cybercrime? Where do you see the most challenges? And who would like to go first? Would you like to go first, Kat?
I can do. So I think the current negotiation process at the UN, we've got two negotiation processes. One is the OEWG, which is looking at state behaviour, and that's not looking at a kind of legally binding instrument at the moment. Some countries would like it to, but that's a very contentious issue. On the other hand, we have the, and so actually we don't see much likelihood of kind of consensus on that in the near future. On the other hand, we have what we call the Ad Hoc Committee on Cybercrime, which is taking forward the Russian proposal to develop a cybercrime treaty. And with any process, any treaty process, any country can bring a proposal, and with sufficient support, that process begins. But the process itself is, getting into the process is quite a long way from agreeing and importantly implementing the provisions of any instrument, because obviously it's the implementation at the end which matters. So we see a challenge around the process having started with some limited support. So because countries aren't then all starting from the same place. In this context, the Cybercrime Treaty started with just under half of the UN membership supporting the process. So not everyone's starting from the same place. And so it's a real test of skill for the chair and for member states to be able to bring that to a successful conclusion that has real world impact. The options, of course, are that hopefully not, but that no consensus is reached. That would mean a failed process, which would be disappointing. Then you could have a process which succeeds, but which not many states actually sign up to and implement. That would also be disappointing because it's a lot of effort to go through to negotiate something which then isn't actually used. And so the ideal scenario that you would aim for is that a treaty is negotiated, everybody agrees it, and then lots and lots of states actually implement it. So we need to kind of measure success against those three scenarios. I think one of the reasons we're more hopeful about the Cybercrime Treaty than we are about prospects for any other kind of treaty in this area, perhaps on state action, is that the aim is quite clear with the Cybercrime Treaty about what states want to discuss and what they're kind of aiming for. And I think that's really important. We've also seen proposals on the state side in the OEWG for treaties where the purpose of the treaty has been a lot less clear. For instance, around perhaps creating global cyber response forces where a state under attack that kind of breached international law might be able to call on other states' support. I think that kind of proposal we've seen has been very difficult. First of all, everybody involved would have to agree whether or not the action was a breach of international law. Then they'd have to be willing to enact the treaty. And all of that would take quite a lot of time, by which time the attack itself would certainly be over. It's very quick in cyberspace. So I think being really clear about the purpose of the treaty, as we are on the Cybercrime Treaty, is a really important element here. And I think the other difference that we see between cybercrime, as we are at the moment, and the state side of things is that the cybercrime discussion, states have national positions. Francine already talked about the importance of it to Cameroon and knowing what they want. I think that's really important because it facilitates a really clear negotiation process. States know what they want, states know what they don't want. You manage to have the conversation and go forward. So that's a real plus on the cybercrime side. I think on the state side of things, we see, I mean, the UK's worked quite hard to publish a national position on the application of international law to state activity in cyberspace, but a lot of states haven't managed to do that yet. And as Kerry-Ann alluded to, capacity is really a key issue here. That process of developing that position is really complex, it's very time consuming. You need legal and policy and technical expertise all together, all across government working together. And so it'll take quite a number of years before a large number of states have these positions and have developed them and published them and can talk about them. And then at that point, that's the basis for then finding an international discussion. So on cybercrime, we're there on that. States have those positions. And on the state side, we're not yet. So it's quite hard to see how we can move forward there. So I think just comparing the two kind of conversations is quite interesting. Cybercrime is a lot further ahead and a lot more, I guess we would be more optimistic about the possibility of finding agreement there. And so we hope that that will come to fruition through the process by, I think, 2024. Back to you, Wafa.
Thank you. So many processes can get very complicated. Right, shall we move over to Francine? How optimistic are you, Francine?
Thank you. It's not easy to take the floor after Kate.
Yes,
uh, Indeed, yes. Governing the behavior of states in cyberspace requires the establishment of a binding international instrument, and this is the expected outcome of the current negotiation process. I remain optimistic insofar as the whole world is facing the exponential increase of cyber attacks and the repercussions on several levels, knowing that no one and no longer allowing the recommendations to be optional, and especially the establishment of this binding international instrument long awaited. So in my opinion, the main challenges to be met include firstly, the fact that we must convince all states to become aware of the urgency of setting up a binding international instrument and to adhere to it. Secondly, the fact of inviting all states to go through the stages of discussions and exchanges on the general concepts, but to develop this binding international instrument in a consensual manner. Thirdly, the real involvement of all states, otherwise those who do not adhere would constitute loopholes, and in this case, how to impose on them the choice of the majority of states without them complaining of interference. Finally, developed and developing countries do not have the same level of implementation of the binding international instrument, which would require support both financially and in terms of training to improve technical skills. So that is my opinion. Yes, thank you.
thank you. And I'll give the floor to Kerry-Ann.
Thanks, Wafa. And I think Kat's reflection gave me a lot of thoughts. It's making me reconfigure what I had planned to answer to this question, because both processes are really so unique, as Kat alluded to, in terms of taking them in their own context. So I think I will change what I had originally said, because it's making me reflect a lot. If you take the first process, the open-ended working group, which Kat referred to, the process is not the first time around, and that's one of the things I think member states recognize. This discussion has been going as far back as 2013, 2012, with previous open-ended working groups around this subject. And I think many member states within the OAS and within the UN more broadly have gone through the rigors and exercise of recognizing how much consensus is needed or not needed, and they've been very active or vocal. We've had reports that have gotten no consensus in the past, for example. So I think from this process, I am hopeful just for the fact that member states have been really honest and clear, and they've been talking. And as Kat said, it's building up that capacity to engage meaningful, recognizing that the open-ended working group is covering a very broad spectrum of topics. So a member state would need to understand its own national position in order to participate meaningfully. So as such, for us, what we have been doing, as I said, is that we've been implementing cyber diplomacy courses like all the time. We have 3 master classes, for example, we decided to develop because of the open-ended working group discussions. We'll be doing one on confidence building measures by itself, state responsible behavior as itself as a master class, and then the applicability of international law to cyberspace as a topic by itself. Because many times when we do our general courses, member states still grapple with, what does this mean, responsible state behavior in cyberspace? And the more we can increase their knowledge and understanding this, the more it will inform their positions at the UN negotiations. I think I'm also optimistic for the ad hoc working group as well, only because we're not starting from scratch. Many member states came into the discussion with the experience from the Budapest Convention before. So one of the things that's pretty clear is that over the years, many persons were building up their legal frameworks around the model of the Council of Europe, Budapest Convention on cybercrime. And as a result, some countries have already been exercising international cooperation in order to investigate international impact cybercrime under that framework, whether it be through investigation, advanced retention of data. There's a lot of experience that came from that process, and it's that I think the UN process has benefited from, because many persons are now coming in green. There are two sides to it for OAS member states. For us, we see that our member states have actually coordinated as groups. So for example, the CARICOM member states have come together and they've had CARICOM positions at the ad hoc working group. And we've seen our Latin American countries as well coordinate their positions and discuss it among themselves before going into the process. And we think that's a state for us. While there may be many legal capacities missing nationally, we're optimistic because that maturity of organizing positions as a group says a lot. The fact that they're able to discuss with like-minded countries as well around the topic says a lot for us. The thing I would conclude on, though, is there's still much need for member states to get clear capacity around legal rules and international legal rules, to understand clearly how the first committee works as opposed to the third committee. Yeah. So some of our less mature countries are still grappling with what's the difference between first and third, what can be discussed at the first and what can be discussed at the third committee. So focusing on that will be one of our role as the OAS, to provide that platform to explain those processes to them so they can meaningfully engage. But on the positive side, I would want to share with you that our special rapporteur that came out of the Department of International Law within the OAS have been doing surveys with our member states. And one clear thing that came out is that all of our member states have an interest in the rule of law. And they do understand that there's a need to have international law in regulating state behavior in cyberspace. So I just wanted to close with that.
Thank you, Kerry-Ann, for this lovely intervention. And thank you all for being here with us today. Have a lovely day and see you at the UN.
Thanks, Wafa. Bye, colleagues.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.